Hello everyone. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made myself this little book for when I'm sewing on the go. And I did not have a pattern, so I'll show you how I just made it up as I went along. I started with making the outside cover for my book first, so I have three pieces of fabric here that are 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches, and then I have two pieces of fabric that are 2.5 by 8.5. I do end up trimming it down later on, but I just made it a little bit bigger for quilting purposes. And now I'm just going to decide which way I want to lay these out for the cover. You could just make a whole piece one solid color if you wanted to, but I wanted to do it a little bit scrappy and use up some of these scraps. So I'm just going to lay these right sides together and then sew them together, and then we'll move on. Now that I have sewn them together, I'm just going to try to decide which one I want to be my front, because I want this to be a trifold book, I believe it's called, just so that I have a little bit more room and I don't have to make it so big and bulky. I'm just going to be using a scrap piece of batting for my quilting. You could use some stabilizer to make it a little bit more stiff, but this is what I had on hand, and it's a great way to use up some of those scrap pieces of batting. So I'm going to cut it a little bit bigger than my actual book because things tend to shift when you do some quilting. And I'm just going to do some straight line quilting on here. You could do whatever you wanted. I just did a simple cross hatch, and once you're done quilting it, it's time to square it up. This is where I decided to trim it all down to 16 by 8 inches. That just seemed like a good size for me, but you could make it whatever size you really wanted. It's your book. I have it all quilted and all trimmed up. I still have not decided if I want the blue in the front or if I want the green in the front, but we have to build the whole inside of the book yet, so we have time to figure that out. I have a piece of fabric here also at 16 by 8 inches. This is going to be the inside of my little book, and now we just need to build some pockets and like a little zipper pouch for my binding clips. And as you can see, my zipper is way longer than what I needed, but we will trim that down later. I decided on this green floral print for my little zipper pouch on the side there. And for this one, I have to figure out how big I need to cut these pieces because, like I said, I'm making this up as I go. And I wasn't sure what size I needed it, so I folded it in half or in threes, and just to kind of figure it out, because I know I have a 1/4 inch on the outside for the seam allowance, and I don't want it to go all the way up to where it's going to fold, because then it's just going to be in the way. I want it a little bit shorter than that. So I folded the book the way it's going to sit when it's all done, and then I just creased it so that I knew exactly where it was. And then I just kind of figured out how many inches I had, and then I worked with that. So I started my pieces off at 3 inches by 8 inches, and then I will just trim it up if I need to. So for this one, I cut 4 pieces at that size, so 4 pieces at 3 by 8. I will write all of these measurements out in the description box, so if you want to make yours the same size as mine, you can. So everywhere I can, I will do that. So I needed 4 of those pieces, and now it is time to sew it onto the zipper so we can build our little pouch. And I don't really work with zippers a lot, so this is kind of new to me. But lay a piece of fabric down pretty sides up, and then lay your zipper on top, and then just line up the top edge of your zipper or the outer edge and just make it all nice and flush. And then you're going to take your second piece of fabric, and we're going to lay that wrong side up, so pretty sides will be touching each other. And here we're just going to have to make sure that we're lining everything up on the top with the zipper, but also lining it up perfectly with the back piece of fabric because we need that all to match up. And as you can see, I left a good amount of zipper on both sides, and this is just going to help me for later on for when I'm trimming and I don't have to be so careful. And for this one here, I'm just going to line it up with my zipper foot and use that as my guide. So I'm not really sure if it was a 1/4 inch or not. I should have maybe measured that, but I just went right along flush with the outside of my fabric and my zipper there. It was pretty close to the zipper teeth there, but I really like the zipper foot on this Juki. It is so much better than on my other one that I had. I can do this so much easier, and it lined everything up nicely, and I got so straight. I won't be avoiding zippers as much as I used to, that's for sure. Once I have done that, I am just going to finger press this all open, and then we're going to need to top stitch that down just to hold everything in place. You could take this to the iron if you wanted to, but you would need to be very careful when you're pressing it because of the heat and the plastic zipper. So I just gave it a good finger press, and then we're going to top stitch it 1/8 of an inch from that folded part of our fabric there. And then this side will be done, and then we're just going to repeat the exact same process on the other side, but making sure that we're lining up all of our pieces so that it's all nice and even, and we don't end up having one that's shifted and it's not matching up with the other side because we need it to be all nice and even. So that's what it looks like. I don't know if you can really see it. I'm just using a neutral thread, the one that I always have in my machine. But once we have both sides sewn on, I am just going to double check that everything is the correct size. And at this point, I feel like I have a little bit too much and it's going to get too close to the edge there. So I do end up deciding that I'm going to trim a little bit off because, well, like I said, I want to make sure that when I'm closing the book, it's not going to have all that extra bulk right there by the fold. It would just not sit right and it wouldn't look right. So I just trimmed a 1/4 inch off on both sides. We need to finish off the edges on one side of this pouch because it's going to be visible. So you could either fold it over and then just iron it. And then when you're sewing it onto your backing, it would sew down and be closed. But I am actually going to use the burrito method and just roll everything up in there and then just match up those two sides and sew that with a 1/4 inch. And then once I've sewn it, I'll just turn it right side out and give it a good press. And then that way that side will be all finished and there'll be no raw edges because I don't like raw edges and I don't like fraying. And I didn't want to have any raw edges inside of the pouch either. And by folding it over, you would. So that's why I ended up doing it this way. And then I'm just going to make sure that everything's smoothed out and it's lined up nicely and that my zipper actually still works. And I'm just going to give this a really good press. And that way, when I'm ready to sew this down, it's all ready to go and I will have no raw edges. But before I actually sew it down, I'm going to build the rest of my book here. These are the scissors that I always use when I am sewing on the go, if I'm doing any cross stitch or if I'm working with binding. So I want to make a pouch that's going to work for these scissors. And then I'm going to make another pocket over here just to slip other stuff in. And for that pocket, I have decided to use these two fabrics. And again, like I said, I had no pattern when I started this, but I did keep track of my measurements and I will leave them in the description box below. I literally just kind of held it up and then lined it up and figured out how tall I wanted my pocket to be and then where I wanted it to sit because like I said, I need to take into account for that 1/4 inch seam allowance and making sure that it's not going to go right up against the fold there. So then I was just going to go ahead and cut this and then I realized that I should maybe make sure that my fabric is laying straight and that my cut will be straight because otherwise I might have a little bit of a wonky looking pocket over here. So I ended up cutting both of these pieces at 5 inches wide and then the lighter green part I left at the size it was, which turned out to be a 5 by 5 square. And then my green floral print that I'm going to be using for the front of my pocket, I ended up cutting that one at 5 by 3.5 inches. And then I realized I should maybe get a smaller ruler. It'd be a little bit easier to work with. So I'm just going to lay those right sides together and I'm just going to sew along the top there with a 1/4 inch. And then for my scissor, I literally just took a piece of paper and I cut it kind of to the size I wanted it and figured out how big I needed it. And depending on what size your scissors are, you're just going to have to kind of figure out how big you need your pouch to be. But once I had it figured out and I was happy with the results, I ended up picking this blueprint for that one and I just laid it or folded it right sides together. That way, once I'm done cutting it, I am ready to sew it together. And I need to keep into account here that my template is the exact size that I want it to be finished at. So I'm going to be cutting a 1/4 inch away from my template. That will give me seam allowance room. So once I have it all cut out, I did end up pinning it down because it kept moving on me. I need to sew this together, but we also need to leave an opening for turning it right sides out. So I'm just going to do that on the top there, leaving about a 1.5 inch gap so that I can turn it out. And then I'm just going to sew all of these together. Then for my little pouch here for my scissors, I am going to cut my corners or just trim them. Trim as close as you can to your seam allowance, but make sure you don't cut into your seam because, well, then it's just going to pop open. And then turn it right sides out. And I did top stitch the little top part of my little scissor pouch there so that it would close up the opening and it would just give it a nice little look. But this is where I want my scissors to sit and I'm not 100% sure on the placement yet. So I need to figure out all the other things that I want on this part of my little book so that I know exactly where I want my scissors. So I want to put a little piece of felt there for my needle. So I have, this is literally the only piece of felt I had. I'm surprised I actually had some. So I'm just going to kind of use my ruler here and measure and guess kind of what size I would like and what would be good for me. And once I have that figured out, and trust me, apparently this took me a while, but I did finally settle on 1 3/4 by 3 inches. Figured that would be a good size to do it. But it would depend on if you made your book bigger or smaller, and it's entirely up to you because I don't need a lot of needles. I just need enough for a few. And then for my thread holder, I just have this little thin round elastic. It's pretty stretchy. And I just tied a little loop on the end and I'm just going to sew a button down there so I can just hook the loop over the button. And I figured this would work good for me. I've seen other people use fabric and make themselves a thin little strip with Velcro, but I didn't have Velcro, so this is the route I went. And then for my side pocket, I sewed a 1/4 inch along the one side there. So I'm just going to clip that top corner there so I can get that corner to turn out nicely. And then I'm just going to turn this right sides out. And this is just going to be so that all my edges are finished and I don't have any raw edges anywhere. And just use my scissor to poke it out. And then I'm going to give it a good press. And now I have all of my pieces ready. So we are now ready to start pinning everything down and taking it over to the sewing machine and then sewing it here. we need to make sure that we don't sew the top of our pocket shut. I'm just going to do a basting stitch along the outer edge and then sew it down on the side. And I'm going to start with all the other little things and leave the zipper pouch for last. So for my elastic here, I'm just going to use a little binding clip and clip it down. And then I'm going to pin everything else down and head over to the sewing machine and sew it all down. For my elastic, I did a lot of forward and back stitching here because I really wanted this to be secure. But I'm just going to do a little basting stitch on that one and then sew my felt down. And then, like I said, just sew around the outer edges of my pockets, making sure that I don't do the top because we need to leave that top open. And just for the record, this is not my design. I have seen books like this on Pinterest and on YouTube channels, but I did not have the pattern. And I figured I would make a video on how you could just kind of figure things out on your own. That way you don't have to go hunting for patterns. And if you're enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I am very thankful and grateful to all the people who watch my videos and who like and comment on my videos to help boost my channel. I appreciate it. So once I have those all basted down, I am going to find a button to sew down over there. But that is my pocket so far. It's starting to look really good. I at least really like this design, and I like the fact that you can just kind of make it up on your own. And I do have a little tub of buttons here, and I was just genuinely surprised that one of the first buttons I see is actually the one that I ended up going with. I did end up digging through here for a while, but I kept going back to that first button that I picked, so that's the one that I ended up using. And then I just held my little string there the way I wanted it to sit and kind of made sure that the bottom of my elastic would be the same distance from my fold as the top. And then I just used a heat erase pen and just left a little mark there. And then I'm going to hand sew that button down. Now the last thing that I need to do is sew my zipper pouch down. I need to sew that one side and then do a basting stitch around the outer edge. So I'm just going to make sure that everything is lined up nice and neat, and I'm just going to use some of my little clips here to hold it in place. I always use clips wherever I can. I prefer them over pins. It's less painful, at least for me. But when I do need to pin, then I will pin. So like that middle section there, I want to make sure that it's not going to shift. So I will pop a pin in there just to hold it in place while I'm sewing it down. But before you head over to the sewing machine, make sure that you're pulling your zipper pull down, because if you leave it up there, you're going to end up trimming off your zipper and, well, you got no pull. So then you're not opening nothing. So I'm just going to make sure that my teeth are nice and close and that they're touching, and I'm just going to put some clips there to hold the zipper in place because you don't want this to move, otherwise your zipper won't close properly, and we want to make sure that it does. So now I'm ready, and I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and I'm going to baste this down. So I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch from the edge just to base it down. And when I get to the zipper portions, I will forward and back stitch a few times just to make sure that it's going to be held in place, because we don't want that to rip open when we cut off the zipper part. So just go all the way around the edge 1/8 of an inch, and then you will have your pouch sewn down and basted everywhere it needs to be. And then we're just going to once again double check that everything's looking good, because you want to be able to fix things before you're completely done your book if you need to do any fixing. Zipper's working good, so I'm ready to trim off the excess. Don't use your good fabric scissors for this. Just use some household scissors. You don't want to wreck your good ones and expensive ones. All right, so I have everything sewn on here for the inside of my book. I've got my button on there, and I probably should have double checked that that button would go through my loop. And for a second there, I was panicking a little bit and thinking I was going to have to go find a smaller button, but it actually worked just fine. So it was good. And I mean, replacing one button would be no big deal. So the inside of our book is all done. So I just laid it on top of the outer section of my book just to make sure that everything was still looking the way I wanted it. And now I need to add a closure for there. And for that, I'm going to make myself a little strap and use cam snaps for the closure. So my strip of fabric measures 8 inches by 1.5. So I'm just going to fold it in half here, and then I'm just going to kind of lay it out and make sure that it is going to work the way I want it after I sew it all together, because, well, you don't want to waste time sewing it and then it doesn't work. So I think this is going to be good. So I'm just going to lay that right sides together and then sew with 1/4 of an inch all the way around the outer edge. But once again, leaving an opening for turning. And once I've done that, I'm going to turn this right side out. But once again, clipping my corners first so that we don't end up having extra fabric there. We want those corners to sit as nice and flush and flat as possible. And then I'm just going to turn it right side out, and I'm going to top stitch all the way around the outer edge, about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, going all the way around. And that's just going to finish it off. And then we're going to figure out the exact placement on the book and sew it down. So I have my book folded the way it's supposed to be once it's all done. And I'm going to fold my little tab here in half and just give it a finger press, because I know I want that to be in the center. So I'm going to have to attach this to the back portion. So it'll be like the middle section, I guess, of my book. So that's why I have it folded the way I want it to be so that I don't accidentally sew it on the wrong part of my book. And I'm just going to kind of line it up and then just kind of fold it over and figure it out. I don't want it to be too tight because if I have lots of stuff in the book, it's going to add a little bit of thickness to it. So I want to make sure that I have room for that. If you would use an elastic closure, then I guess it wouldn't really matter because it could stretch, but I don't have an elastic closure. So now I just need to decide how close I want it to be to that folded edge there. And I ended up deciding to go with 1.5 inches from the edge there. And then I also need to make sure that I have it centered from top to bottom. And I know that my book measures 8 inches tall at this point, so I need to measure 4 inches down to the center of my tab. And then once I am happy with the positioning of it, I am just going to hold it in place and very carefully unfold my book and try to not move anything and just try to keep it as flush as or in the same spot. And I'm just going to use a pin to pin that in place. And then I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew this down just by sewing like a little rectangle on there, making sure that I don't go past to the point of where my fold is supposed to be. But before I go and I add my cam snaps here, I do want to make sure that I do have everything in the correct position. So I'm going to fold it the way I want it to be and double check. And yes, I do like the way it looks. And I'm thinking this is going to be a really cute little book. And why not have cute things when you're working? I bought this cam snap kit on Amazon and I got it for like super cheap. I'll leave a link to it in the description box below if I can find it. It came with the clamp and everything and all the tools you needed. I just laid out a bunch of the snaps and then I just decided on the color that I wanted. And then here I'm just going to kind of eyeball it as to where I want it and use my little tool to poke a hole so that I know exactly where I want my cam snap to be. And then I'm just going to add that one on there, making sure that I'm putting the right pieces where they're supposed to go. If you don't know how to use one of these, they're actually very easy to use. I looked on YouTube and I found a bunch of videos and it's actually very easy to use this kit. And I'm actually just going to use this piece right here and I'm going to press it down to kind of dent the fabric. And then I know exactly where I need to put my second piece. But make sure that you're actually lifting it up and you don't accidentally poke through a bunch of the layers of fabric that are not supposed to have a hole in them. And then I'm just going to clamp that one down too. And then I will have a nice little closure on here. There are different ways to make closures for these books. You could use the method that I did, or you could use Velcro, or just make a tie, but I prefer the snaps. I don't know, I just always have. All right, now we are ready to start assembling this book and finishing it off. So I'm just going to layer my lining there, making sure that I'm putting wrong side with wrong side. And then I'm just going to add a basting stitch all the way around the outer edge. And then I'm going to add binding to mine. You could sew it right sides together and then leave an opening for turning and then just use it like that. But I prefer the binding look. I don't know, I just kind of like that. I sewed my binding to the outside of my book and then I'm going to fold it over to the inside and then hand sew it down. That's just the method I prefer. I did not show this process because I am working on a video on how to do binding and all the different ways that you can finish off your binding when it comes to joining it. I figured that would make a really good video because there are so many different ways that you could actually finish off that join and some are good for beginners. But this is what it looks like. It's all done. It is not 100% the way I had hoped it looked, but I am very happy with it and I really like it. But like I said, you could add a tie here. Like I've seen some, they just sew a long string to the back there and then just wrap it around and tie it in the front here. But I prefer this method and it's entirely up to you how you want to do it. But I really like this book. So as you can see, you can put up just 2 spools of thread there and I got my little scissors. And then I always have 2 needles for sewing and then one for when I do my binding corners. I got a heat erase pen in here and a little seam ripper because you always got to have Jack around. And then over here is a nice little pouch to keep all your binding clips in and other stuff. And a thimble when I finally do go buy one because I desperately need a thimble already. But anyways, that is my book. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by and until next time.